The night Isaiah Archer found her, the temperature had dropped so fast that the water in his horse trough had begun to skin over with a thin crust of ice. And the wind off the Colorado plains was the kind of wind that didn't just chill a man. It reminded him how small he was against the dark, enormous sky. It was November of 1874, and the land around Cutter's Bend, Colorado, was the kind of place that sorted people into two categories quickly enough: those who belonged to it and those who were merely passing through. Isaiah belonged to it. Had belonged to it for 6 years, ever since he'd ridden west from Tennessee with $40, a mule, and a stubbornness that his mother had always said would either save him or bury him. He'd built his ranch on a stretch of land near Galloway Creek with his own hands, log by log, fence post by fence post, until the property stood as a testament to the particular kind of quiet suffering that turned into something a man could eventually call pride. He wasn't a lonely man, exactly. He was a solitary man. There was a difference. Loneliness implied wanting something you didn't have. Isaiah had more or less made peace with what he had, and what he had was a good barn, 40 head of cattle, 12 horses, a border collie named Patch, and the particular satisfaction of watching a sunset without anyone demanding he put words to it. He'd been out that evening checking the fence line along the eastern pasture because 2 of his younger steers had been testing it, and by the time he made it back toward the barn, the cold had settled so thoroughly into his bones that he was thinking about nothing except the cast iron stove in his kitchen and the leftover venison stew he'd made 2 days prior. The barn doors were latched, same as always. He'd latched them himself that morning. But when he put his hand to the latch, there was something slightly off about it. The wood of the doors was pulled in just a hair differently, as though someone had opened them and tried, not quite successfully, to close them from inside. Isaiah paused. He was not a reckless man. He unhooked the lantern from the post beside the barn door and turned up the wick before he stepped inside, and he kept one hand loose near the Colt on his hip, though he didn't draw it. He'd learned that a man who went everywhere with his gun already drawn was a man who'd already decided the world was his enemy, and he hadn't decided that yet. The barn smelled of hay and horses and the faint sweetness of old oats, and his 4 horses shifted in their stalls at the light. Patch, who had come trotting after him from across the yard, pressed against his leg and then simply sat down, which was Patch's particular way of saying that whatever this was, it was not a threat. Isaiah lifted the lantern. She was in the far corner of the barn, tucked between a mound of hay and the feed chest, lying on her side in a way that told him she'd arranged herself there with deliberate care. She'd pulled loose hay over herself like a blanket and had her coat, a thin, inadequate thing, spread over the top of that. And lying there on her chest, tucked under her chin with both small fists curled against her breastbone, was a baby. The child couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 months old by the look of it, sleeping with the absolute boneless trust that only very small children manage, one ear pressed to the woman's heartbeat like it was the only sound in the whole world that mattered. The woman's face was beautiful even in sleep and in exhaustion, which Isaiah could see she was deeply in, because she hadn't stirred at all when he came in with the lantern. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever she'd pinned it with and spread across the hay in waves. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of many nights with very little rest. Her shoes were worn through at the toe of one, and her left stocking had been repaired so many times the heel was more thread than fabric. Isaiah stood there for a long moment and looked at her. Then he looked at the child. Then he looked back at her. He did not wake her. He was a practical man, and the practical facts were these. It was 28 degrees outside and getting colder. The barn was maybe 35 degrees, which was better but not enough. And she was a woman alone with a baby who had chosen a stranger's barn over whatever the alternative was, which meant the alternative was considerably worse. He didn't need her awake to understand the broad strokes of the situation. Isaiah set the lantern down carefully on the feed chest and walked back out of the barn. He went to the house and he lit the stove. He fed it 2 good-sized logs and let it catch properly, then went back out to the barn and gathered a folded wool blanket from the cedar chest he kept there for when he had to sleep with a sick animal, and a second blanket from the hook near the tack room. He returned to the corner where she slept and spread both blankets over her and the child without touching either one of them. The child made a small sound, a bubbling exhale, and turned its face slightly into her neck, and the woman's arm tightened on instinct, pulling the baby closer without waking. Isaiah retreated to the door of the barn. He stood there for a moment, looking at them both. There was something that moved through him right then that he couldn't have named accurately if someone had put a gun to his head and demanded it. It wasn't pity exactly. It was something closer to recognition, the particular ache of seeing someone fighting very hard just to keep going and knowing the fight. He went inside. He warmed the stew. He put a second bowl on the back of the stove and kept it warm, and then he sat at his kitchen table with his own bowl and ate, and waited to see what morning would bring. She was awake before the sun. He knew because he heard the baby first, a thin, wavering cry that drifted from the barn across the cold pre-dawn air and reached him through the kitchen window where he sat with his coffee. He had not slept much. He'd been too busy listening, in that half-alert way, for any sound of trouble. He rose and pulled on his coat and hat and went out. The barn doors were open. She was standing just inside them, the baby over her shoulder, bouncing it in that automatic rhythm of someone who'd been doing it so long it had become as unconscious as breathing. She'd seen him coming across the yard and she didn't run, which he took as a decent sign, but she squared her shoulders in a way that made it clear she wasn't going to be caught cringing either. She was young. Up close in the gray morning light, he could see that. 23, maybe 24. Her eyes were the color of creek water in summer, a green-gray that changed as she moved her head. Her jaw was set with the particular determination of someone who had been humiliated before and had decided it would not happen again without a fight. "I am sorry," she said. Her voice was steady, which cost her something, he suspected. "I will go. I didn't mean to put you out. I thought I could be gone before you noticed." "Where are you going?" Isaiah said. She blinked. It was clearly not the question she'd been expecting. "Farther west," she said after a pause. "I have people in Durango." "You walking to Durango?" She drew herself up slightly. "I have a horse." Isaiah looked past her into the barn. One of his horses he knew, and the other 3 he knew. And then there was a 5th animal in the last stall that was small and ancient, and had the look of a horse that had been carrying too much for too long. It was a gray mare with a swayed back and dull eyes and ribs that showed too clearly even under her winter coat. "That horse won't make 20 miles, Isaiah said. "She's made it this far." "How far is that?" Another pause. The woman shifted the baby to her other shoulder and the baby grabbed a fistful of her hair. She untangled it with practiced fingers without breaking eye contact with Isaiah. "We came from Pueblo," she said. "We have been traveling 8 days." Isaiah looked at her for a moment, then at the horse, then at the dark blue sky beginning to lighten in the east. "Come inside," he said. "There's stew on the stove and coffee. Then you can go." She looked at him the way people looked at things they wanted very badly and didn't trust. "I don't take charity," she said. "It's not charity," Isaiah said. "It's breakfast. I made it for myself and there's too much. Come in out of the cold." She came. Her name was Fannie Shepard. She told him that when she sat at his kitchen table with the baby on her lap and both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. The baby's name was Clara, and Clara was 4.5 months old and had her mother's same gray-green eyes and a small, determined mouth, and absolutely no interest in sleeping during the day. Isaiah warmed milk in a small pan and found the sugar in the cabinet, and watched the woman drink her coffee and eat 2 bowls of stew while pretending she wasn't as hungry as she was. He didn't comment on it. He refilled her bowl without asking. "You live here alone?" she said. "Yes. Long time. 6 years. She looked around the kitchen. It was a simple room but a well-kept one. Tools hung where they belonged, a shelf of books along the south wall that surprised her. He could see the surprise, and a clean wood floor that had been swept recently. "The blankets," she said. "That was you." "Yes." She looked at him. "You could have woken me." "You needed the sleep more than I needed the explanation," he said. Something moved across her face at that. Some complicated thing she quickly folded away. "Husband died," she said, suddenly, flatly, the way people said things they'd said so many times that the words had gone smooth from use. "In April. His name was Robert Shepard. He was shot in a dispute over water rights outside of Pueblo. We had a small farm. His brother took it after. Said the title was in Robert's name and I had no legal claim." Her chin came up. "Which, in the state of Colorado in the year 1874, is perfectly legal, so there's nothing to be done about it." Isaiah set down his own coffee mug. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard run of luck," he said. "I had some savings. I took Clara and I left. I have a cousin in Durango who wrote me last spring. Has a small boarding house. She said there might be work. On that horse you won't reach Durango before Christmas." "I'll manage. Fannie," he said. He used her name without thinking about it, and she looked at him slightly startled, as though not many people did. "That horse needs at least 2 weeks of good feeding and rest before she's fit to carry you anywhere, and you're not in much better shape yourself, with respect." "I don't need a man to tell me my condition," she said, but it was mild, not sharp. "No," he said, "I don't suppose you do. I'm telling you as a neighbor, or near enough to one." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "I have a spare room. It's small, but it has a real bed and a window that doesn't let in the wind. You and the baby could stay while your horse recovers. I won't charge you for it. You can do whatever you think is fair in exchange, help with cooking or mending if you want, but it's not required." She looked at him with those creekwater eyes for a long time. "Why?" she said. It was an honest question, and she deserved an honest answer. He thought about it. "Because it's the right thing," he said. "And because that baby is 4 months old, and the temperature last night was below freezing. And I will not be a man who turns that away from his door." Fannie Shepard looked down at Clara, who had gotten hold of one of Fannie's fingers and was examining it with great seriousness. Then she looked back up at Isaiah. "2 weeks," she said. "While Bess recovers, then we'll be on our way." 2 weeks, he agreed. It became 3 weeks, and then 4, and then it was December and there was snow. The first week was careful and polite and characterized by a great deal of staying out of each other's way. Isaiah kept his usual hours, up before dawn, out to the cattle and horses, fence and feed, and the particular endless maintenance of a working ranch. Fannie kept the kitchen and took meals seriously, which he noticed on the second morning when he came in to find biscuits that were the best thing he'd put in his mouth in 2 years, made from nothing but the flour and lard and salt he already had. She'd found dried apples in the pantry and made a compote, and the kitchen smelled like something from a life he'd almost forgotten existed. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, sitting down. "I told you I'd help with cooking," she said, with the dignity of someone keeping their end of an agreement. "I usually just have bread and eggs in the morning." "That's because you haven't had biscuits," she said. He ate 4 biscuits, and she watched him with an expression she tried to keep neutral, and Clara sat in a sling arrangement Fannie had made from a piece of cloth, batting her hands at the steam rising from the coffee. By the second week, the politeness had loosened a little. Fannie began to learn the rhythms of the ranch and adapted to them without being asked. She kept an eye on the stove fire and made sure there was always coffee. She found the mending basket and worked through a significant pile of torn shirts and split seams without commenting on the size of the pile, which Isaiah appreciated because he knew it was considerable. In the evenings, after Clara was down, she would sit at the kitchen table with a book from his shelf, and he would sit across from her with whatever needed doing, a harness to repair, accounts to go over, and they would be quiet together, which is a very different thing from being silent. "You have a lot of books," she said one evening. "My mother was a school teacher," he said. "I grew up thinking books were part of the furniture." She held up the one she'd been reading. It was a collection of Whitman's poetry, the 1867 edition. "Do you believe this?" she said, "that we contain multitudes?" "I think some people do," he said. "Some people are pretty much just the one thing." She smiled. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it changed her face entirely, opened it up, put light in those gray-green eyes. He found himself wanting to see it again. Clara got a cold in the middle of the second week. It was nothing serious, but it was miserable. The baby was stuffed and cranky and woke constantly at night, and Fannie was pale and hollow-eyed by the third day of it. Isaiah said nothing until Thursday evening, when he came in from the late feeding to find Fannie standing at the kitchen counter with Clara on her hip and both of them at the end of their rope, the baby crying with the particular desperation of a child who is not truly sick but is deeply uncomfortable, and Fannie's eyes wet with exhaustion she was too proud to let spill over. Isaiah crossed the kitchen, took the baby from her arms and said, "Sit down." Fannie was too tired to argue. She sat. Isaiah walked the floor with Clara against his chest, the way he'd watched Fannie do it, the slow, steady bounce with one hand on the baby's back. Clara protested for about 45 seconds and then, apparently deciding this was acceptable, subsided. He kept walking. He could feel Fannie watching him from the chair. "You've done this before," she said. "My sister had 3 children in 4 years," he said. "I was the nearest available set of hands for a good stretch of time." "Where is your family?" "Tennessee," he said. "My mother and my sister's family are still there. My father died when I was 16. I left when I was 22. "Do you miss it?" He thought about it honestly. "I miss my mother," he said. "I miss Sunday dinners. I don't miss the life that was waiting for me there." Clara had gone limp against his shoulder, the sticky, boneless weight of a baby on the edge of sleep. He kept his voice low and even. "What happened to your family?" he said. "Your family of origin." "My father was a printer in St. Louis," Fannie said. She'd drawn her knees up in the chair and wrapped her arms around them, and she looked younger like that, softer. "My mother died when I was 12. I had 2 brothers. One went to the war and didn't come back. The other is in Kansas City doing something respectable and boring. We write twice a year. My father died 3 years ago. So it's just you." "It's just me and Clara," she said. She said it without self-pity, just as a statement of fact. "That's sufficient." Clara was fully asleep. Isaiah stood there a moment longer and then very carefully transferred the baby back to Fannie, who tucked her against her chest with the automatic ease of a woman who had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. "Thank you," she said. "Go to sleep," he said. "I'll check the stove in the night." She looked at him for a moment with something in her expression that was complicated and careful, and then she took the baby and went to bed. The snow came in the first week of December, the real snow, the kind that came off the Rockies and meant business. 3 feet in 2 days, and then a cold so fierce it cracked the post of his front gate and froze the pump, so he had to haul buckets from the creek twice a day. It was the kind of weather that made a man's world very small and very interior, and it made the idea of Fannie and Clara traveling 200 miles through mountain country in the back of winter not just difficult but genuinely dangerous. He didn't say this to her. He didn't have to. She stood at the kitchen window on the morning the second heavy snowfall came and looked out at the white buried world and pressed her lips together and didn't say anything for a long time. "Durango," she finally said. "We'll have to wait until spring." "I expect so," Isaiah said. "I'll earn my keep," she said, turning from the window. "I'm not a person who sits idle." "I know you're not," he said. She had already demonstrated this at considerable length. She had reorganized the pantry, repaired 4 of his winter shirts, learned which of the horses liked to be brushed from right to left rather than left to right, made 3 kinds of preserves from the late apples in the cellar, and managed to make the spare room feel like an actual room rather than a storage space with a bed in it. She had also, without being asked, begun teaching herself which of the daily ranch chores she could manage without his help, so that when he was occupied with the cattle or the fencing or any of the 100 other tasks a ranch in winter demanded, she kept things running at the house end without him having to think about it. and she was good company. That was what kept catching him off guard. He had spent 6 years in the pleasant and sufficient company of himself and Patch and occasional visits from his nearest neighbor, Ned Garrity, who ran a spread 3 miles east and who was a decent man, but not what anyone would call stimulating conversation. Fannie was stimulating conversation. She had opinions and was not afraid of them, but she also listened, genuinely listened when he talked, which was rarer than people realized. She laughed at things that were actually funny, and not just at things it was polite to laugh at. She read his books and talked about them afterward. In short, she was becoming the thing he had not realized he was missing, and the recognition of that came slowly and then all at once, in the way of most important things. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks into December, when the temperature had briefly climbed to something survivable, and the sky was that hard, brilliant blue that only happens in winter in high country. Isaiah had been in the barn working on a cracked wheel hub that had been needing attention for a month, and Fannie had bundled Clara into enough layers that the baby resembled a very small, very unhappy parcel, and brought her out to get some air. She'd been walking the length of the yard with Clara, letting the baby look at the white expanse of snow with wide, amazed eyes, when Isaiah came out of the barn to get a different tool. He stopped in the barn doorway and watched them for a moment. Fannie was talking to Clara in a low voice, narrating the things they were passing, the fence post, the crow on the fence post, the far blue line of the mountains, a horse looking over a stall door. Clara was listening with the intense seriousness that babies apply to everything. The low winter sun was behind them, and it lit Fannie's dark hair with a kind of warmth that made something turn over in Isaiah's chest, slow and certain as a wheel. He stood there too long, and then she turned and saw him, and instead of looking away he just stood there a moment more, which was not something he normally did. "She's never seen snow before," Fannie said, walking toward him. "She finds it very suspicious." "Smart child," Isaiah said. Fannie looked up at him. There was a beat between them, a pause, in which something was clearly present that had not been present a month ago, and they were both aware of it and neither of them said anything about it. Then Clara grabbed at a loose button on Fannie's coat and the moment passed. But it didn't go anywhere. It stayed, that awareness, the way heat stays in a stone after the fire's moved on. Ned Garrity came by the following Tuesday on his way into Cutter's Bend for supplies, and he found Isaiah splitting wood in the yard and raised his eyebrows at the domestic scene visible through the kitchen window where Fannie was moving around the stove. "Got company," Ned said. "A traveler sheltering the winter," Isaiah said. Ned had the look of a man assembling a sentence he'd been preparing for some time. "People talk, Isaiah. People always talk," Isaiah said, bringing the axe down. "Her reputation, she's a widow with a baby who came through here on her way to Durango and got caught by the snow," Isaiah said. He straightened and looked at Ned levelly. "And that's the whole of it, and anyone who says different is welcome to come say it to my face." Ned held up his hands. "Easy. I'm not saying anything, I know what you're just," Isaiah said. "She's a decent woman in a hard situation. I'm not going to put her and a 4-month-old child out in a Colorado winter because of what people might say in town." Ned nodded slowly. "You like her," he said. He wasn't saying it as a problem. He was saying it as a man who had known Isaiah Archer for 4 years and was privately relieved to see evidence that the man had a pulse. Isaiah did not answer that, which was itself an answer. After Ned left, Isaiah went inside for his midday coffee and found Fannie at the table with Clara on a blanket on the floor and a letter she was writing on the table. She looked up. "Your neighbor," she said. "Ned Garrity. Did he disapprove of my presence?" Isaiah poured his coffee and sat down. "He mentioned people talk." Fannie's pen didn't stop moving. "People always talk," she said, "especially about women who fail to be in the correct place doing the correct thing." She finished a line and looked up. "Does it trouble you what they say?" "No," he said. She looked at him for a moment as though measuring the honesty of that, and then she nodded and went back to her letter. "I'm writing to my cousin in Durango," she said, "letting her know I'm delayed." She'll be expecting you, he said. Eventually, Fannie said. She's a practical woman. She'll understand. He watched the way the light came through the south window and lay across her hands as she wrote. He watched the way she paused sometimes to look at what she'd written, and the way her mouth moved slightly when she was deciding on a word. It was entirely domestic and entirely ordinary, and it was also, in some way he couldn't quite account for, the most content he had been in this kitchen in 6 years. Fannie, he said. She looked up. He had not planned anything. I'm glad you stayed, he said. That is, I mean to say, I'm glad the weather made it sensible. I am glad of the company. He stopped because he was making a poor job of it. She looked at him steadily. So am I, she said, quietly, meaning it. Christmas came, which surprised Isaiah by being something he cared about. He had not decorated the house in 6 years, had let the holiday pass as a quiet occasion marked mostly by a slightly better meal and an early night. But Clara was 5 months old and looking at everything with enormous fascinated eyes, and Fannie had mentioned once, in passing, that she used to love Christmas as a child, before things got harder. And so the week before, when Isaiah rode into Cutter's Bend for supplies, he bought a strand of red ribbon from the dry goods store and a small packet of dried cranberries, and did not examine his reasoning too carefully. He came back and put the ribbon on the mantelpiece and strung the cranberries in a garland the way his mother used to do, and when Fannie came into the front room and saw it, she went very still for a moment, just a moment. Then she pressed her hand briefly to her mouth and turned to look at him. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. She was quiet for a beat. It looks like Christmas, she said. That was the intention. She laughed, that real laugh that opened her face up, and he felt it in his ribs. They spent Christmas Eve with Fannie's biscuits and Isaiah's venison, and a bottle of good brandy he'd been keeping in the cupboard since 1871, without a specific occasion to justify opening it. Clara sat on Fannie's lap and appeared to approve of the cranberry garland, reaching for it with both hands and expressing serious frustration at not being able to reach it. They talked at the table for 3 hours without noticing the time passing, about books and about the land, and about what they each thought they had wanted at 20, and what they actually had now, and whether those things were as different as they'd expected. It was the kind of conversation that only happens when something between two people has already been decided, without either of them having officially said so. At one point Fannie told him about the day Clara was born, Robert already dead for 4 months by then, in a rooming house in Pueblo with only the landlady's wife to help her, and the particular terrifying miracle of it, of this small fierce person arriving into the world in the middle of everything falling apart, and how she had looked at Clara that first morning and thought, all right, then, we keep going. Isaiah listened to all of it. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes. He just listened, which was, Fannie later thought, the most important thing he'd ever done. Then she said, you never said why you left Tennessee. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and the fire made a low, contented sound against the cold. There was a woman, he said. It wasn't dramatic. We were promised to each other, more or less, the way you are in a small town, everyone expecting it. But she wanted the life that was already there, and I kept looking west. We both knew eventually it wasn't going to work. She married a good man, she's happy. He turned his glass. It wasn't heartbreak exactly. It was more like understanding that some roads just don't go where you thought they were going. And this road, Fannie said. She was looking at him with that direct way she had, and the candlelight made her eyes look darker, warmer, and the fire was behind her, and the red ribbon was on the mantelpiece, and the baby had fallen asleep against her chest. This road, Isaiah said slowly, is the best thing that ever happened to me. And I have been stubborn and stupid enough that it took me nearly 6 years to have the sense to appreciate it properly. She held his gaze. You're talking about the ranch, she said, but her voice had a question in it. Partly, he said. The silence between them was so full it was almost a sound. Then Clara stirred and Fannie looked down, and the moment shifted from enormous to tender. Isaiah rose and took his glass to the counter, and when he turned back around he said, "Happy Christmas, Fannie." "Happy Christmas, Isaiah," she said. Her voice was soft. January came down hard and mean, and with it came Holt Bridger. Holt Bridger was a man who operated in the spaces between legal and lawless, the kind of man who appeared wherever there was something to be taken advantage of. And what he was taking advantage of in the winter of 1875 was the general difficulty of a hard season. Riding between the smaller ranches and farms in the Cutter's Bend area, and offering to buy out those who'd had a rough year at prices that sounded fair only, until you looked at the county land records and realized what those properties were actually worth. He'd bought 3 parcels in the fall this way, and he'd had his eye on Isaiah Archer's Galloway Creek land for some time, because the creek access was valuable, and Isaiah's 40 head of cattle made the operation look like a working concern worth taking. He showed up on a Thursday morning when the temperature was so low the breath from the horses was freezing before it dispersed, and he tied his horse at Isaiah's gate and knocked on the door like a man who expected to be welcomed. Isaiah answered. Fannie was in the kitchen behind him, and she could see the man over Isaiah's shoulder, tall, with a wide-brimmed hat and a coat that was too good for the weather, the kind of man who spent money on clothes so people would know he had money. "Archer," Bridger said. He had the big open voice of a man accustomed to being believed. "Heard you had a rough summer on the cattle. Thought I'd come by and see if we couldn't work something out." "I had a fine summer," Isaiah said. "Well, now, that's not what I heard. Heard you lost near 15 head to that sickness going around in July." "I lost 4. I have 42 head currently. You can count them if you'd like." Bridger's smile stayed, but something in it cooled. "That right. Well, look, even so, this is a hard country, Isaiah. Be hard for a man alone to maintain a spread this size long term. I'm offering a fair price to take it off your hands before I'm not selling," Isaiah said. "Now just hear me out." "I have heard you out," Isaiah said. "The answer is no. It will continue to be no. Good morning, Mr. Bridger." He closed the door. Fannie was standing at the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed. "Who was that?" "His name is Bridger. He's been buying up land around here. Several families sold to him over the fall, the Morrisons, the Dunbar widow. He gives them less than the land is worth, and they take it because they're desperate." "Will he be back?" Isaiah went to the window and watched Bridger ride away. "Probably," he said. "Men like that don't hear no very clearly." He was right. Bridger came back 2 weeks later, this time with a man named Terrell who looked like he was employed specifically to be large and unfriendly. Isaiah met them at the gate this time before they could knock. "I told you no," Isaiah said. Bridger's tone had changed. The affability was thinner. "You're being foolish," he said. "One bad winter, one sick herd, one broken season, and a man alone has no cushion against it." "Then it's lucky I'm not alone," Isaiah said. That surprised Bridger. His eyes moved to the house where Fannie had appeared on the porch watching. "Your wife," Bridger said. "That's my business," Isaiah said. "My answer is no. If you come onto this property again without invitation, you'll be trespassing, and I'll treat you accordingly." Bridger studied him for a moment. Then he clicked his horse around and rode off with Terrell at his heels, and he did not come back again, whether because he believed Isaiah or because he had easier targets elsewhere. Either way, the problem with Bridger resolved itself, which was how most problems resolved themselves when a man made it clear he would not be moved. Fannie came down from the porch when they'd gone. She stood beside Isaiah and watched the road. "You told him you weren't alone," she said. "I didn't want him thinking he was dealing with an isolated man," Isaiah said. She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Are you alone? In the way that matters, I mean." He turned to look at her. The cold had put color in her cheeks, and her dark hair was coming loose from its pin the way it always did by midday, and she was looking at him with that direct gaze that he'd come to understand was her truest self, the part of her that had survived losing everything and come out the other side not broken but clearer, stripped down to what was actually real. "No," he said. "I don't believe I am. Not anymore." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "Good." And she turned and went back inside, but she was smiling as she went. and he stood there in the cold for a moment, his heart doing something it hadn't done in years, and then he followed her in. There was an evening in late January, with 2 feet of snow outside and the stove running hot, and the lamp turned down low, when things became clear between them in a way that didn't require very many words. Clara was asleep in her cradle, which Isaiah had made quietly in the barn one afternoon while Fannie was washing, and Fannie was on the settle with a book and Isaiah was at the table, and at some point she read something and laughed softly and read it aloud to him, and he turned to listen, and then she looked up over the book, and the way the lamplight fell across his face made her stop mid-sentence. "Isaiah," she said. He pushed his chair back and came to sit beside her on the settle, which was close quarters, and she did not move away. He took the book from her hands and set it on the table and then simply looked at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you staying? In the spring, when the road to Durango is passable, are you going?" She was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to stay?" "Yes," he said. "I want you and Clara to stay." He stopped and looked at her steadily, because he was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and he was not going to start now. "Fannie, I have spent 6 years building something here, and I am only now understanding what I built it for. I would like, if you were willing, to build the rest of it with you, if that's something you could consider." She looked at him with those gray-green eyes for a long time. He didn't look away. "I came here running," she said. "I came here with nothing but a sick horse and a baby and the back end of a very bad year." "I know," he said. "And you lit the stove," she said. "You didn't make me explain myself or prove myself or beg, you just lit the stove." He had not thought of it that way. He nodded. "That," she said, "is the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." She reached out and took his hand. She had a small hand but a strong one, the hand of a woman who had done hard things, and when she took his, something settled in his chest so completely that he realized only by its absence how long he'd been carrying a kind of hollow waiting. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles very gently. She drew a slow breath. "Yes," she said, "I'm staying." He looked up at her. "I'm staying," she said again more firmly, with a small, real smile breaking across her face. "If you'll have us." "I'll have you," he said, "both of you, gladly." He did not kiss her then. He waited 2 more weeks for that, because he wanted it to happen the right way, not in a rush or a heated moment, but clearly and deliberately as a choice. It happened on a February afternoon when she was standing at the kitchen window watching the snow come down, and she turned to say something to him, and he was right there, closer than she'd expected, and she stopped speaking, and he looked at her face for one long moment, and then he kissed her. It was a gentle kiss and a certain one, the kind that has no question in it, and she kissed him back with both hands flat against his chest and her whole self present in it, not holding back. And when they broke apart, she pressed her forehead to his jaw, and he put his arms around her, and they stood like that in the kitchen with the snow falling outside and the stove warm at their backs. "We ought to do this properly," he said, into her hair. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means I'd like to marry you," he said, "with a preacher and everything legal. I want Clara to have my name if you'll allow it. I want to do it right." She pulled back far enough to look at his face, searching it. "You mean that?" she said. It was not quite a question. "Every word of it," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she smiled, the full real smile, the one that changed everything. "Then yes," she said, "I mean that too." The road into Cutter's Bend became passable in mid-February during a brief warm spell, and Isaiah and Fannie rode in together with Clara bundled against the cold, and tied the horses in front of the office of the Reverend Thomas Hollis, who was a compact, white-bearded man with ink on his fingers from his other occupation as the town's part-time notary, and who took one look at the two of them, and said that he'd been expecting something of this nature. "Word travels," he explained, with a benign smile, leading them inside. "It always does," Fannie said. The service was small and private, just the 3 of them and the Reverend, and Clara, who behaved beautifully for the first 12 minutes and then made her opinions known enthusiastically for the remainder, which the Reverend graciously talked over. Isaiah stood beside Fanny in the Reverend's front room and said the words clearly and meant them, everyone, and she said them back with the same clarity, the same intention, and when the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, Isaiah did gently and Clara grabbed his collar and pulled. They were married. Ned Garrity came by the following week with his wife, Martha, who brought a dried apple cake and gave Fanny the kind of handshake that managed to communicate complete solidarity in a single grip. There was a brief social awkwardness in town. There were 2 or 3 women who had their specific views on propriety and were not hesitant to share them. But the women of Cutter's Bend who had been actually looking at the situation without prejudice, which was most of them, thought that Fannie Shepard had done sensibly, and that Isaiah Archer had done well. And the awkwardness faded by spring the way most things do when the actual events of life take precedence over people's commentary on them. Spring came the way it always does in Colorado, suddenly, almost violently, as though the land had been waiting and then simply couldn't hold off any longer. The snow melted and the creek ran fast and the first green pushed up through the brown grass, and the cattle moved out to pasture, and everything smelled like wet earth and possibility. Bess, Fanny's gray mare, had spent the winter eating good hay and resting, and she was genuinely improved by April, not young again, not capable of a 200-mile mountain journey, but comfortable and capable of the gentler business of a working ranch, which she took to with an elderly dignity. Fanny was glad she hadn't had to sell her or put her down. There was something important about Bess surviving, about all of them surviving, that she didn't have to put into words because Isaiah understood it. They wrote to Fanny's cousin in Durango in March. The cousin's name was Millie Stroud, and she wrote back a letter that was equal parts relief and delight and mild reproach for Fanny not writing sooner, and which ended with a promise to come visit in the summer. She came in July, a vigorous, round-faced woman of 30 who took one look at Isaiah and one look at the ranch and one look at the way they moved around each other in the kitchen, easy, comfortable, attuned, and said to Fanny quietly while Isaiah was outside, "Good Lord, Fanny, I was worried sick about you, and you ended up in the very best place." "I know," Fanny said. "How on earth did you manage it?" Fanny thought of a cold barn and a warm stove, and a man who hadn't asked her to explain herself before taking care of her. "I just kept going," she said, "and I stumbled into kindness." Clara grew as babies do, with alarming speed and comprehensive enthusiasm. By spring she was sitting up on her own, examining everything within reach with a focused scientific interest. By summer she was pulling herself upright against anything that would bear her weight. Isaiah came inside one afternoon in August to find her standing at the coffee table, both fists gripping the edge, absolutely delighted with herself, and he stopped in the doorway and called, "Fanny," and Fanny came from the bedroom and they stood there together watching their daughter. He had used the word so easily by now, so naturally, because that is what she was, stand up in the middle of the kitchen in the afternoon light. "Look at her," Fanny said very softly. "I am looking," Isaiah said. He had his arm around Fanny's waist without thinking about it, and she had her head slightly tipped toward his shoulder, and they stood there together in the kitchen doorway watching Clara be triumphant. Sometime in October of that year, 1875, Fanny told him. She told him on an evening very like the first one she'd told him things of importance. After supper, with Clara in bed, in the quiet that had become, over nearly a year, the most comfortable quiet he had ever known. She came to sit at the table where he was going over some figures, and she waited until he looked up. Her eyes were the same creekwater gray-green they'd always been, but there was something in them, a light, warm, and significant. "I believe we're expecting another baby," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he set down his pen and reached across the table and took both her hands in his. She watched him. "Are you glad?" she said. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the slight held breath behind it. "Fanny," he said. He stood up and came around the table and sat next to her and put his arms around her, careful and close, and she leaned into him. "Yes," he said, "I am so glad. Are you well? How are you feeling?" She laughed slightly against his shoulder. "Tired. And I cannot abide the smell of coffee at the moment." "That's a sacrifice," he said. "I know it is," she said. "I feel very strongly about coffee." He held her, his hand on her back, his chin at her temple, and outside the night was that particular deep Colorado blue with more stars than any reasonable person needed, and the creek was running low and clear over the stones, and the cattle were settled in the pasture, and everything was exactly as it should be. The baby was born in June of 1876. It was a boy. They named him James Thomas Archer, James after Fannie's father the printer and Thomas after the Reverend who had married them, which pleased Reverend Hollis enormously when he was told. James arrived with considerably more fanfare than Clara had. The labor was long and hard, and Martha Garrity came to help, a woman of great practical competence who issued instructions with the calm efficiency of someone who done this many times, which she had, having raised 5 children of her own. Isaiah was sent outside to walk in circles, which he did for 3 hours, and then Martha came out and told him he had a son, and that Fannie was tired but entirely well. He went inside and sat on the bed beside Fannie, who was indeed very tired, and looked at the small red face of his son, and felt something so large and specific it was almost frightening. "He looks angry," he said. "He's new," Fannie said. "Give him a moment to form an opinion." Isaiah looked from the baby to Fannie's face. She was pale from the work of it, and her hair was damp and loose, and she had never in any moment in all the time he'd known her looked more beautiful than she did right then, holding their son and looking up at him with absolute calm certainty. "How do you feel?" he said. "Like I climbed a mountain," she said, but satisfied with the view. He kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes. "Stay," she said. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Clara, who was now a year and a half and extremely interested in the new situation, had to be prevented from climbing directly onto the bed and examining her brother at close range. She settled for peering over the edge of the mattress with intense suspicion. "Baby," Fannie told her. "Baby," Clara repeated, in a tone that suggested she was reserving judgment. Isaiah lifted her up so she could see properly, and she looked at James for a long, serious moment, and then looked at Isaiah, and then looked at Fannie, and then back at James. And then she patted the blanket he was wrapped in, very gently, which was as close to approval as she was inclined to offer that first meeting. The years that followed were the kind of years that don't make for dramatic stories but make for real lives, which is considerably more valuable. Isaiah's ranch grew. He added 10 acres of good grazing land along the creek in 1877, bought with 3 years of careful profit, and put up a new barn the following spring with the help of Ned Garrity and 2 other neighbors. A working bee that lasted 4 days and involved Martha Garrity's cold chicken and Fannie's bread, and a quantity of conversation that Isaiah, left to himself, would never have generated but which he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he enjoyed. Fannie found in the spring of 1877 that she had a talent for horses that went beyond simply caring for them. She had an eye for the particular gifts of each animal, and a patience with the young ones that was something between art and instinct. Isaiah began, that summer, to let her take on the breaking of the young stock, which she did with a methodology that got results he had not managed himself, and which eventually became one of the distinguishing qualities of Archer stock in the Cutter's Bend area. Horses that were well-tempered and sensible, which people specifically sought out. Clara grew into a fierce, curious child with her mother's directness and her father's quiet intensity, and a particular passion for animals that meant by the time she was 3, there was a succession of foundling creatures brought to the house: a bird with a broken wing, a rabbit with a lame leg, a lamb rejected by its mother. Isaiah built her a small pen near the barn for the purpose, and she maintained it with a seriousness of administration that made Fannie press her lips together to contain her smile. James, as he grew, was different from his sister in the specific ways that made it clear they were both entirely themselves. He was a sunny, patient boy who took after Isaiah in his tendency to observe before he acted, and his capacity for sitting quietly in the company of things he found interesting. He liked the cattle in particular, and by the time he was 3, he could name every one of the 47 head on the property, which impressed people and amused Fannie. Old Bess died in the winter of 1878. She was 22 years old and had carried Fannie 300 miles and lived another 4 years in comfort, and was put in the ground on a cold December morning while Clara, who was 4, cried with the comprehensive grief of a child who does not yet know how to be modest about mourning. Isaiah dug the grave and Clara put a handful of dried grass in it, and Fannie stood with her hand in Isaiah's and said a quiet private thing that wasn't quite a prayer but was in that neighborhood. "She was a good mare," Isaiah said. "She saved our lives," Fannie said, "getting us here." Isaiah put his arm around her. "She did," he said. That Christmas, for the first time since Fannie had arrived, the house was loud. It was full of the particular loud of small children, who have reached the age of knowing what Christmas is and caring about it intensely. Clara had opinions about where the cranberry garland should hang. She remembered it from years before with absolute certainty, the way children remember things that mattered to them. James helped hang it, or helped in the specific way of a 2-year-old, which meant occasionally pulling it down rather than up, but his enthusiasm was not in question. Fannie stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her husband and her children decorate the front room and felt something so complete that it almost frightened her, the way full things sometimes do. She had come here with nothing. She had come here running in the cold with a sick horse and a baby and a thimbleful of hope, and she had stumbled into this warm, lit, wonderful thing that was nothing she had planned and everything she had not known she needed. Isaiah caught her eye from across the room and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for 2 years now, with an easy, settled warmth that had replaced the careful, tentative thing from the early days, with all its held breath and unspoken questions. All those questions had been answered. He knew it, she knew it. "Come here," he said, reaching out his hand. She crossed the room and took it, and he tucked her against his side, and they looked at their children, who were now arguing amiably about the optimal position for a pinecone on the shelf, and the fire was going, and the stove was warm, and it was Christmas. "I have been thinking," Isaiah said into her hair. "Tell me," she said. "About a thing Whitman wrote," he said, "about containing multitudes." He was quiet for a moment. "I think I understand it now. I think I understand it because of you." She looked up at him. "I had one kind of life for a long time," he said, "a good life, and then you came through my barn in November and you brought all of this." He looked at the room, the children, the warmth, the red ribbon on the mantelpiece. "All of this was inside you and you brought it here, and I think multitudes might be what it means when one life becomes large enough to hold more than you expected." Fannie looked at him for a long moment, that clear, direct, gray-green look that still, even after everything, could make his chest feel tight. "Isaiah Archer," she said, "that is the most words I have ever heard you say at one time." "I have been saving them," he said. She laughed and kissed him, there in front of the children and the fire and the cranberry garland, while Clara ignored them with the serene indifference of a child who has long since decided that her parents' kissing is simply a feature of the environment, and James looked at them with brief interest before returning to the pinecone situation. In the spring of 1879, Fannie bore them another child, a boy they named Robert for her first husband. It was something she'd thought about long and carefully, and talked to Isaiah about with the honesty that had always been the foundation of what they were together. And he had said without hesitation that it was right and good, that Clara deserved to have her father's name remembered, that Robert Shepard had been a real man who had deserved better than what he got, and that honoring him cost nothing and was the decent human thing to do. Robert Archer was born in April, when the first wildflowers were coming up along the creek, and he had his father Isaiah's dark hair and his mother's gray-green eyes, and an expression of absolute placid contentment that remained his primary characteristic for the next several years. 3 children. A working ranch that was known across 3 counties for good cattle and good horses. A house that had been added onto twice now, a proper sitting room and an extra bedroom, because the family had grown, and the little log house that Isaiah had built for himself alone was not quite equal to the task anymore. A neighbor in Ned Garrity who had become a genuine friend to both of them, and Martha who had become the nearest thing Fannie had to a sister in this country, and Reverend Hollies, who married them and baptized each of their children and came to Sunday dinners twice a year, and ate more of Fannie's biscuits than anyone could reasonably account for, and who said on one of these occasions, looking around the table at the family assembled there, "There are not many things in this life that go as right as they ought to. When I see one that has, I like to name it." "What would you name this one?" Clara asked him with her precise 4-year-old directness. The Reverend considered. "Grace," he said. "I'd call it Grace." Isaiah caught Fannie's eye across the table. She was smiling. He was smiling. It was the same smile, the same understanding, the one that ran between them like water over stone, clear and constant and deeper than it looked. One October morning in 1880, 6 years after a cold night in November when she'd crawled into a stranger's barn with nothing left to lose, Fannie Archer stood at the window of the kitchen and watched her husband come across the yard toward the house. He was 42 steps from the door, which she knew because she knew this view so well she could have counted them in her sleep. He was carrying a bucket and he'd left his coat in the barn the way he always did when he forgot he'd taken it off, which was often. Patch old Patch, gray around the muzzle now but still insisting on going everywhere with Isaiah, was at his heels, which was also always. He looked up and saw her at the window and lifted a hand. She pressed her own hand flat to the glass. Behind her, in the kitchen, James was explaining something to Robert about the proper way to sort dried beans, which was apparently a matter of some importance. Clara was in the barn with the horses, which was where Clara usually was. The smell of coffee and cornbread was in the air, and the stove was going strong against the October chill. Isaiah came in the door and set down the bucket and looked around the kitchen and then looked at Fannie. "You're looking at something," he said. "I'm looking at you," she said. "Anything interesting?" "Everything," she said. He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her and looked out the window at the yard and the pasture and the barn and the far blue line of the mountains, the same view they'd both been looking at for years now. Clara was visible in the corral, working a young dun horse through a slow circle with the patient, particular authority that was entirely her own. "She's good," Isaiah said. "She's you," Fannie said. "That patience, that quiet." He shook his head. "She's herself." "She's the best of both of us," Fannie said. He put his arm around her waist. She leaned into him. They were quiet together for a while, the way they'd been quiet together from very nearly the beginning, not the silence of nothing to say, but the silence of no longer needing to say everything out loud because enough of it lived in the air between them without words. "You're happy," he said. "Not a question. Remarkably," she said, "unreasonably, given everything that led here." "Not unreasonably," he said. She turned to look at his face. He was looking at her, not at the window, not at the yard, at her. The way he'd been looking at her, more or less, since February of 1875, in a kitchen not much different from this one when she'd been reading Whitman on a settle and he'd come and sat beside her. "Isaiah," she said. "Fannie," he said. "I'm glad my horse broke down," she said. He blinked. Then he laughed, the real laugh, the one that came from somewhere low and true, the one she'd been hearing for years and never got tired of. "That is," he said, "the most unexpected thing I have ever heard. She was a terrible horse by the end," Fannie said, "but she got us here." "She did," he agreed. "And you didn't wake me," Fannie said. It was something she'd said before over the years when she was being reflective, when she was looking back at the long specific chain of small mercies that had led to this life. It was something she thought about often, the fact that he could have woken her. He could have knocked on the barn door, could have called into the cold dark, could have stood over her in the lamplight and demanded her business and her credentials and her justification for being there. Any number of men would have. "You just lit the stove," she said. Isaiah looked at her for a moment. "You needed the sleep," he said, the same thing he'd said that first morning. "And Clara needed to be warm." "And now," Fannie said. He looked out the window at the yard, at the property they'd built together, at the corral where their daughter was working a horse with her quiet confidence, at the blue sky above the mountains, at the smoke rising from the chimney of their home. "And now," he said, "everything I ever built anything for is right here in front of me." He looked back at her. "And I would light that stove every day of my life without hesitation." Fannie looked at him. Her gray-green eyes were bright. "Good," she said, "because the mornings are getting cold again." He kissed her temple. She smiled, that real smile, the one that had first appeared across a table over a bowl of stew on a gray November morning, and had never really gone away since. She turned back to the window and leaned against him and watched the yard and the mountains and the sky. And behind them James was explaining bean sorting to Robert with considerable authority. And the stove was warm. And Patch lay down at the door with an old man's satisfied groan. And the day continued on around them, full and ordinary, and exactly what a life is supposed to be when it has gone as right as it should. That evening, after supper, after the children were in bed, Isaiah sat at the kitchen table and Fannie sat across from him, the lamp between them, and she had a book and he had his accounts, and the fire made its low sound against the night. She lowered the book after a while and looked at him. He looked up. They looked at each other in the lamplight, and no words were necessary, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said or that couldn't wait until morning. And they were not going anywhere, either of them, and the world outside was big and dark and cold and full of difficulty, as it had always been, as it would always be. But in here it was warm. It had always been warm from the moment he lit the stove, and it always would be.